Thank you everyone for joining my talk. My name is Zhila Aghajari and I'm a PhD candidate in Computer Science Department at Lehigh University. In this talk, I'll be discussing our paper mechanism by which prevalent online communities' behavior influence people's response to misinformation, when we explore whether or not perceived norms actually play a role here in influencing people's response to misinformation. And this work is motivated by the one that my co-author and I published in CSCW 2023, when we showed that there are many interventions designed to address misinformation. However, most of these interventions, at least implicitly, consider misinformation as these pieces of content that needs to be addressed. However, by reviewing prior studies, we show that there are many community-oriented mechanisms that are involved in this phenomena of misinformation, mechanisms that are both impacted by misinformation and contribute to the impacts of misinformation as well. We provided empirical evidence in our CHI paper last year showing that misinformation influenced how people of a community perceived what is normative in that community surrounding misinformation. By perceived norms, we are referring to people's perception about what is normative, and that can be really different with actual norms of an online community. And there are different types of these perceived norms. We have descriptive norms that refer to people's perception around how common a behavior is within a community. Injunctive norms that refer to perception around whether a behavior is endorsed by people in a community, and subjective norms that refer to our perception around how we think we are expected to behave in a community. Now, prior work shows us that these perceived norms might actually be involved in the way people respond to misinformation. For instance, there's this piece of work by Gimpel et al. 2021 showing that when a piece of content is disputed by others in a community, people are less likely to share that piece of content because they also assume that that piece of content might be misleading. Here's another work by Colinder et al. Showing that people often pay attention to how others in the community comment about a piece of content when they are assessing the veracity of that piece of content themselves. Here's another example, again, designed to manipulate perceived norms by nudging people about how most responsible people in a community think twice before they share a piece of content. They show that this intervention actually make it less likely for people to spread misinformation. Now, all of these prior studies provide great insight about how others might influence people respond to misinformation, but they also attribute this influence to the role of perceived norms. However, none of this work actually measured perceived norms. So it remains unclear whether it is others' behavior that directly influence response to misinformation, or is it actually the case that others' behavior influence people's perception about what is normative, and then those perceptions influence people respond to misinformation? Or it's possible that it's a combination of these two. However, we don't know because none of these prior studies actually measured participant perception about what is normative. And that's what we have been exploring in our experiments. And to do that, we manipulated perception about what is normative experimentally, but we also measured our participant perception about what is normative. Now, the first challenge is, how do we do that? How to actually manipulate perception about what is normative in an experimental setting? To do that, there are insights from prior studies, including our own experiments, showing that prevalence of behavior actually influence people's perception about what is normative. But the challenge is that not all of people's behavior are actually observable online. For instance, there are so much of content surrounding vaccine, both leading and misleading content, but others' behavior or people's behavior in a community surrounding vaccine, whether or not they have been vaccinated, is not clear based on their online interaction. So how to influence perceived norms in these contexts that are either less or not at all observable based on online interaction? In our work, we hypothesize that in this context, prevalence of communicating about a behavior where the behavior itself is not observable can influence different types of perceived norms, including descriptive, injunctive, and subjective norms. And with that setting, we investigate whether this is others' behavior or communicating about a behavior that directly influence people respond to misinformation, or is it actually the case that this prevalence of communicating about a behavior influence different types of perceived norms, including descriptive, injunctive, and subjective norms? And these perceived norms that actually influence intention to respond to misinformation surrounding a behavior. Or again, it could be a combination of them, and that's what we have been exploring in our work. To examine these questions and hypothesize, we designed this simulation-based experiment using this platform called TrueMin, which is an open source social media simulation, very similar to Facebook platform. However, researchers have all the control over the content and the type of interaction that goes into this platform. While this platform gives us this high degree of experimental control, it also gives us high degree of experimental realism, so that our participants do not know that they are part of this experiment and all the content are actually created by the researcher. They assume that these content are created by actual people. Of course, we debrief our participant by the end of our experiment. Now, to manipulate communicating about a behavior, we use this feature designed and launched in 2015 by Facebook, which is adapting profile picture frame to either show support or oppose for different causes. And here are some examples of it. For instance, on the left, we see example of how people use this profile picture frame to communicate to support Black Lives Matter movement. Or here we see an example of how people use this to show support for people of minority and as well as to ask peace for people of Ukraine during the war. And in the context of vaccine, where there's a lot of uncertainty involved and a lot of misleading information involved, many people decided to communicate about being vaccinated with their network by adapting this profile picture frame. So with this setting, we designed this three condition between subject study and manipulated prevalence of communicating about being vaccinated with three different ratios of 5, 15, and 30%. And conducting this experiment, we learned that prevalence of communicating about a behavior in our study about being vaccinated actually did not affect people or participant intention to respond to misinformation surrounding vaccine. However, prevalence of communicating about being vaccinated influenced different types of perceived norms, including descriptive and injunctive norms. That is, when people see many others communicate to be vaccinated, they consider vaccination to be a common behavior that is conducted by many people in the community. That is descriptive norms, but they also consider vaccination to be endorsed by people of that community. That is injunctive norms. We did not see the effect of this manipulation on perception about subjective norms, and we discuss in our paper why we think that might have been the case. Now, these perception, specifically descriptive norms, now influence people's intention to respond to misinformation. That is, when people perceive vaccination to be a common behavior in a community, they are more likely to intervene and respond to false and misleading content surrounding vaccine. Now, these results provide important implications, both for designing community-centered intervention to address this information and for designing interventions to help individuals communicate about their behavior and influence how their community's norms are perceived. Specifically, our study demonstrates the role of descriptive norms on people respond to misinformation. So it's important to design around this community-centered mechanism to influence responses to misinformation. For instance, we can think of highlighting how others in a community address misinformation and expect more engagement in addressing and mitigating the impacts of misinformation. We can also think of nudge-based intervention by reaching out to people of a community and asking them to engage in addressing misinformation. But we also can let them know about the impacts they can have in mitigating some of the impacts of misinformation. By letting them know that if they join this effort, more people are likely to join this effort, and together they can protect norms of their communities, we can expect more such engagement as well. Also, while our prior studies show that misinformation have this broader impact on how norms of a community are perceived, here we see that community members themselves can play a role in mitigating some of this impact by communicating about their behavior. So it's important to provide tools for individuals to communicate about their behaviors, especially those that are targeted by misinformation. For instance, during the time of a health crisis, there are so much of guidance by health authorities, but there are at the same time so much of misleading content surrounding this guidance. So we can provide tools for online communities to communicate about their behaviors in this context and influence how their community's norms are perceived. So people can communicate about being vaccinated, being masked, or following social distancing, and influence how their community's norms are perceived in this context. Similar tools can be designed to help individuals communicate about their beliefs that are targeted by misinformation, such as beliefs in health authorities or belief about the importance of engaging in the election and voting in different elections. For instance, during the time of elections, there are so much of misinformation questioning the legitimacy of the election and considering participation in this election as pointless. But people can communicate about how they believe in the participation in election and influence how their community's norms are perceived in this context. So our work helps us understand how we can design around perceived norms to help address some of the impacts of misinformation and encourage more people to engage in addressing misinformation. But perceived norms are just one of the examples of community-oriented mechanisms. We reviewed different community-oriented mechanisms that are involved in the phenomena of misinformation in our CSCW paper, such as majority illusion or designing around peer influence or social network structure. So we encourage more research in this direction to account for the community-oriented mechanisms that are involved in this phenomenon. Thank you so much for listening to my talk, and I'm happy to answer any question on our paper.